With the release of Transformers 1, it's time to stop, look back, and rank all 9 Transformers movies from my least favorite to my favorite. Welcome to Cinema, where we focus on the film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the Transformers movies from your least favorite to your favorite. Do you like the franchise as a whole? Do you not like it? Or is it somewhere right in the middle where it's a bit of a guilty pleasure? And make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about a lot of cinema as a whole. And getting into last place, we have Transformers: The Last Knight. Now, if this was a film that was on its own a sci-fi action film, you would still wonder about all the problems that it contains, but it may still be something that you take for what it is. The action can be good for its own substance, but being the 5th film within this live action franchise, where we go on from this, and from the same director, Michael Bay, it just feels completely lackluster compared to the rest of the franchise. Mark Wahlberg just doesn't feel like he has the right connection to all the Transformers, all the bots, and losing the primary Transformer from the franchise, Optimus Prime, and not necessarily being able to write in a good replacement or a good narrative that leads on throughout the story involving the government, involving the main characters, where you never really cared for them as much to begin with. It really makes the writing go into all these weird choices, weird aspect ratios to the film, what you're getting out of the picture, the visuals, not too appealing to really drive home the force of what you're getting out of the narrative as a whole. So therefore it just becomes this boring subplot that really builds upon itself in a way that just doesn't really have the means to an end to draw me in and excite me no matter what sort of action it has going on. And even though it sort of has this world-ending threat that's sort of promised with what they're taking out of the villain, obviously you're not really expecting that to fully happen on Earth. And so it becomes predictable to a certain degree. And even when it does have its highest threat, it just isn't enough to hold its own stance with the writing that makes everything else feel lackluster by the end. And at number 8, we have Transformers: Dark of the Moon, the 3rd movie in the franchise that just doesn't hold its own for the franchise with Shia LaBeouf, what we get from the end of his trilogy. There's something to the substance there. It has a little bit to its ideas that starts to get me going, starts to get me intrigued, but by the time that the ideas are formulated and everything is pulled off, at the end of the day, I just don't feel connected to what is all going on. And the sense of intrigue is lost by the execution of all the action, the characters that just don't really drive home and get me interested, feeling the stakes of the momentum that is really building up throughout the film, but just doesn't ultimately have the payoff that is worth my time, especially with the lengthy runtime that most of these films have. Which leads me into next place. We have Transformers: Revenge of the Fallen. Now this is an interesting one, going back to the Transformers as the sequel, and what we get out of it, it has decent narrative beats along the way. What we get out of Shia LaBeouf, how he's pulled off, and still having the best chemistry over Mark Wahlberg, connecting with the robots and everything that goes along with that. But there's not necessarily something that is still a driving force. You don't care for every little subplot that they try and manage to squeeze in there. I don't really care for Shia LaBeouf and Megan Fox's relationship. So there's certain beats along the way that really takes us down a notch and doesn't necessarily build upon the suspense or the action that could be the driving force of this film. There's cool explosions that are the Michael Bayisms of this franchise as a whole, but ultimately it still loses its ground by the end of the day. Which leads me into number 6, Transformers: Rise of the Beast. Now this is an interesting one just by its own nature, having these prehistoric aspects to the beast itself and building them upon the Transformers, it's interesting to some regard, but in execution, it just feels like a lot of the same things being played out. And compared to some of the ideas, while I'm not familiar at all with the original show, what these are pulled off, I don't know if the prehistoric ones exist within the show, that it's taking part of that source material to life. But it becomes less compelling because of all the muted colors, the muted scenery that just doesn't pull me in as much. There's a sense of decency to the story. It has a good amount of narrative beats that pulls me in just a little bit to be able to enjoy the action, enjoy some of the time that you're getting with the characters, but it doesn't necessarily have all the substance that really establishes a good story, a good, well-rounded idea that really pulls the story forward and manages to get me into the grounds of what it's trying to explain with its message, or what it's trying to do with all the action, because the setting can really take a force back with this film and make it less compelling, less interesting, because your eyes don't really have an appeal to be able to watch outside of what you're getting out of what you're visualizing. Next up, we have Transformers, the original. Now, what can be one of the best one day can be a little lackluster on the rewatch, and just what we get out of this. Of course, I'm not a huge Transformers fan. For what we're just getting out of some of the mindless action fun, I love more thought-provoking films, and so while there is substance to this story, where I get the intention of what this film is trying to do, of what it's trying to build up with this franchise, how it's establishing all its characters, ideas, and of course the Transformers themselves, it has some good things to it, but it has a lot more flaws, some narrative beats that trip up along the way, add a couple too many subplots, a boy that's chasing after this girl. Well, there's also the fate of the world at the hands of what's all going on with those components. There's a couple contrivances, certain pieces of evidence that all lead and fall into place at some of the right times, and just what we get out of Shia LaBeouf, while he is kind of good for his connection with the Transformers, he's not necessarily the key actor that I would say has a great performance, or his connection with Megan Fox. I still don't love what the characters have to say with what they're doing. The story is decent for what it's tackling, but ultimately can lose some ground with managing to capture my attention all the way through, especially with how the length of the runtime can really distract from my desire to rewatch these films again. And at number 4, we have Transformers Age of Extinction. Now, this one is a little bit of a guilty pleasure. It's certainly not a great film. It certainly isn't one of my favorite films, but there are, of course, the flaws along the way. But what we get out of Mark Wahlberg, it is weird to change the cast the 4th film in, but there is something to Mark Wahlberg's performance that brings it out a little bit more, making certain reactions or ideas, what his connection to the government ends up being, be a little bit more compelling. What we get out of the robots, everything that goes about with the battles, certain things that really come up a lot more this time around. It's still a longer film. That's not something that I try and rewatch whatsoever very often. In fact, I only watched them for the first time last year, and so getting back into this one, it still doesn't have some deep complex lore or ideas to it, but what it does for building up the stakes, building up and having no compromises for what it takes on with our main characters and the robots, how we're establishing all the settings, it at least has a lively, more settled environment that makes it easier to watch and more compelling with what it does with its action. And at number 3, we have Transformers the movie. Now, the original 1986 animated movie I watched for the first time just a couple weeks ago, and I was rather rather compelled by it. It isn't still a standout movie. I don't have any former nostalgic connection, like I said, to Transformers the show, or even this movie as its original form was. And so what we get out of it still, though, that we didn't get out of any of the live action movies or even the newer one, is something that creates all these different new unique Dinobots, Constructobots, other robots that we haven't seen that are still mostly taking place on a foreign planet, and how that all consists of all of its energy, how it establishes characters. It feels very rushed in some retrospect to what it's establishing, and not necessarily diving deep into what it's doing with its characters, and having a couple human side characters that don't have a whole lot to offer to the story itself, except to be utilized as certain characters that sort of serve as plot devices to the story. You can't really feel connection to it. I can see why some people would love this and what it pulls out so differently than the rest of the Transformers movies have done in live action, but it doesn't fully ground its base on what it's tackling, even if it is one of the better Transformers movies, which leads me into number 2, Transformers 1. Now this is a rather step up from what we've gotten before. It's still not a groundbreaking film. I do appreciate what it's doing, what it's tackling, especially leading into the third act. The animation is rather good, what we're getting out of the ideas, the origin and prequel. We're finally getting its own Cybertron planet-based film that doesn't involve the humans, doesn't involve Earth, and takes us to an unfamiliar world that sort of doesn't have a whole lot of flavor to its own regard. It feels still familiar, and there's many story tropes along the way that I was able to feel like it was too predictable. It had many elements of stories that I personally have seen from films before, having seen many films, and so the story treads on many narrative beats that are quite familiar, but it still has its own ground to where those parts of the story aren't particularly bad or objectively wrong things to do or things to tackle within the story. And ultimately, once it leads into that third act, once it establishes more of the stakes, more of the battle, and gets that human connection with what we're getting out of the rise of Optimus Prime and Megatron, how they revolutionize the idea, our connection with those characters, it just makes it that much more significant by the end of the film. Which takes me into number 1, we got Bumblebee. Now this is the more grounded film of the Transformers franchise. It doesn't feel like it has the highest stakes of the world, but it's also the beginning to what we're getting of the Transformers movies. Just a simple coming-of-age style story with Hailee Steinfeld as a great performance. And what we get out of Bumblebee, getting to know Bumblebee's character and how he learns the language of humans and learning through the radio and everything, all the quirks and gizmos that he utilizes along the way, just becomes compelling by the nature of exploring the culture of how he learns the language, what he manages to do, his connection to the humans, how he learns to trust. There's something to not only the human characters, but Bumblebee as a character that we see and love as one of the most compelling characters of the Transformers, but getting the baseline layers of Bumblebee as a car, as a character, and beginning to build upon the blocks, upon the mechanics of that car, and be able to fall in love with it, to get the grounds of where we're taking the story once we're technically leading into the first Transformers movies. And what we're getting out of that just manages to capture my love, capture my attention for the film, for the characters as a whole, taking the action to some of the best layers that it has been, and just being able to build upon organic relationship between what it does with its main human, its main Transformer, and not interfering too much with over convoluted storylines, too much with the action, while losing the baseline ideas of what it wants to ultimately do with its story, which it takes me to the number one of the Transformers franchise. Let me know down in the comments below how you would rank the Transformers franchise from your least favorite to your favorite. How many have you seen? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Or do you find it somewhere in the middle for the franchise as a whole? Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.